Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are talking about Nintendo Switch 2's cross-generation situation and how it just got even more interesting. There are different things that are coming up in the rumor sphere and the news sphere that are coloring this conversation more and more, and are definitely stirring different opinions on how this is going to go about. So if you're unaware, cross-gen refers to cross-generational, this idea of a game coming out for two different consoles from two different generations. Here's a few examples from Nintendo. The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, which came out for both the Nintendo GameCube and the Nintendo Wii around the same time, and also The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which came out for the Nintendo Switch and the Wii U. Two different consoles from two different generations. And so when it comes to Nintendo Switch 2, with so many people who are still enjoying their Switch, many are hoping and thinking that there's going to be a great many games that are going to come out on Nintendo Switch 2 and have enhancements for that console, but also there will still be a version available for Nintendo Switch 1 owners. Now I do think there are going to be some cross-gen games, and I do think there are going to be more than prior generations when it comes to Nintendo, but I'm not sure it's going to be as prevalent as it is on other consoles in this day and age, like with Sony. The majority of Sony published games on PlayStation 5 are still on PlayStation 4. There are only so many PS5 exclusive games where you need a PS5 to enjoy that experience. Yes, they look and run better on PS5, but if you have a PS4 even years after PS5 has come out, there are still many modern games that you can enjoy today. So what's the situation looking like for Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch 2? That's what I would like to talk more about today. But before going forward, let me ask that if you do enjoy my content, to please subscribe and hit the notification bell. For today's sponsored message, I would like to thank MoaPad for providing both this MoaPad second mechanical controller Binary Star HD Ultimate version for Nintendo Switch, and this really nicely sized and comfortable and secure Switch carrying case. I really do like the feel of it. It feels quality, premium, and it's sturdy, and I definitely feel like my Switch and all my little accessories will fit safely in here. But the reason it's larger than normal, it's because it houses the Nintendo Switch while sporting these nifty Joy-Cons that are the Joy-Cons that I showed you in the box. So these Joy-Cons are pretty darn awesome, I would say. They have the HD linear motors, so essentially HD rumble, and it feels pretty satisfying. And they also have the increasingly more and more popular Hall effect joysticks. They work beautifully. They feel pretty awesome. When looking closely, you can see that they have a nice texture to offer some comfortable grip. And then simply the ergonomics of these feel a lot better than the normal Joy-Cons. I've talked about this many times, but whenever I'm holding my Switch in handheld mode with the normal Joy-Cons, if I'm holding it for a longer period of time, especially if I'm laying down, the angles at which I hold it tend to not feel too comfortable for my hands long term, but something like these feel pretty good. I mean, these Joy-Cons feel so good that I'm comfortable using them instead of the Pro Controller. But there's also something else special about these Joy-Cons. You can customize them a little bit. They come with a few different plates you can change around. So on the right side, you can change around what you feel around the right joystick. If you don't like having that round, perfect circular opening for your analog stick on the right side, you can change the faceplate and it snaps on very smoothly. It's easy to put on and take off, and you can just move the joystick as so immediately. On the left side though, there's a few options. You can still go for the round way, or, as I just changed it from, you can stick with the angular style, which I really appreciate. It reminds me of the GameCube controllers back in the day, and what's cool about this is that it allows you to be more accurate with your specific directions, especially for fighting games and the like. But also you can change out the D-pad. Now the D-pad here I actually really like. It's nice and clicky and satisfying, and it feels extremely accurate, but there is another option. So you can go for more of a round look and feel, or more of a directional precision feel. Something else I'll note, shoulder buttons feel fantastic. I love the clickiness of them. They feel extremely satisfying to press. And beyond that, I'll also note the macro buttons here if you like to use those. And these Joy-Cons feel pretty good, and they're pretty easy to connect and charge. They work just like normal Joy-Cons do. So they're pretty awesome, and I definitely recommend checking these out. They will be linked in the description below along with a carrying case, and I'd like to thank MoaPad once more for sponsoring today's video. So the most commonly discussed possible cross-gen title for Nintendo Switch 2 is Metroid Prime 4, and there is certainly a conversation to be had on whether this game is going to be coming out this year as just a Switch 1 title, or if it will be saved for a few months later into 2025, where it can fall into the Switch 2 launch window, and while it still would release for Switch 1 owners, there would be a version for Switch 2 that has some enhancements so it can look and run well on the new console and showcase the next generation for Nintendo. It may seem like a bit of a toss-up here, but I would like to discuss some job listings that have been discovered by Doctray81 that may shed some more light on this situation. So there was this one listing that was showing a hiring for a director of engineering at Retro Studios, and this is what it reads. Retro is a uniquely wonderful engineering environment in a number of ways. We focus purely on Nintendo hardware, so we get to build technology that gets every drop of performance possible. The team speaks milliseconds. Every developer and discipline cares deeply about hitting our aggressive frame rate targets. We take pride in creating truly best-in-class graphical experiences on Nintendo hardware. This means that our graphics technology is always front of mind for Retro. So when reading this is coming from Retro Studios. This is showing the vision of Retro Studios. And when you consider the history of Retro Studios, you look at games like Metroid Prime, 2, 3, Trilogy, and then also Donkey Kong Country Returns and Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, and even Metroid Prime Remastered, which is considered to be one of, if not the best looking games on Nintendo Switch, there's a long and consistent history of when Retro Studios puts out a game, it is a game that is showcasing the best of the hardware. All of their games run at a smooth 60 frames per second. All of their games are showcasing visuals that many did not think were possible for their respective consoles. And so I bring this all up to suggest that when it comes to Metroid Prime 4, a game that's been in development for such a long time, that Nintendo has kept close to their chest that they have not shown even a lick of footage for, or even a screenshot for that matter, I'm leaning in the direction of this game being saved for Nintendo Switch 2. It will still come out for Nintendo Switch 1. It has been listed for Nintendo Switch 1 for so many years, not just during Nintendo's fiscal earnings releases, but also in the different job listings we have seen. Metroid Prime 4 being made for Nintendo Switch 1 have still been mentioned. So we have evidence from different places and just the initial promise of Nintendo to bring this game to Switch 1. So it's not going to be moved over to just Switch 2. That much we pretty much know with almost 100% certainty. But with how close we supposedly are to next generation console, and with how ambitious this game supposedly is, and with how Retro Studios likes to push their games, I really would be surprised if there's not a cross-gen version being planned. But that's just one game for this conversation. There's a lot more to discuss here. So looking at Nintendo's past, and considering both Twilight Princess for the GameCube Wii transition, and Breath of the Wild for the Wii U Switch transition, those are the only examples of cross-gen games. So some think that we may only have just like that one cross-gen game that's kind of like the bridge title from one generation to the next, and that's it. And Metroid Prime 4 has been a big part of that conversation because it's in a similar scenario. However, Metroid Prime 4 is not considered to be as big of a seller as Zelda, so maybe it's not a good fit. I'm not totally sure I agree with that thinking, but let's consider another possibility here. How about Pokemon Legends ZA? This is a mainline Pokemon game that's being developed by Game Freak, but we've seen a very interesting change of pattern here. So for the last several generations for Pokemon, not console generations, but Pokemon generations, which tend to span 3 years, it's now looking like that pattern of the 3-year gaps has now changed. We were seeing annual releases for mainline Pokemon games, and they were always making sure they had some sort of mainline release every single year, seemingly even at the cost of quality when we look at something like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. But with Legends ZA, they didn't announce a remake or remaster coming out alongside of it like they did for Legends Arceus and Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, but just Legends ZA, and it's not even coming out in the same year it's been announced as they typically do, but the year after. But what's also interesting, when we look at the original trailer for Legends Arceus, the first Legends game, they told us they would be coming out earlier in that next year it would be coming out. They did not for Legends ZA. And so the thinking has been that Legend ZA is not coming out this fiscal year, it's coming out sometime deeper into 2025. Maybe it still falls in the first half, there's obviously some debate to be had there, but it's definitely not looking like a January release. And it could possibly be something positioned as a launch title or launch window title for Nintendo Switch 2. Now some will debate that this makes no sense because another pattern we've seen from prior Pokemon games is that when they jump from one handheld to the next, they wait a couple years until there's a lot more hardware out there so they can experience strong software sales. However, in the past, this idea of cross-gen was not really a prevalent concept. Now, it is. And with everything we've heard about backwards compatibility for Switch 2 and what we expect based off patterns and such, perhaps it makes more sense to think that Legend ZA should be a cross-gen title. Because not only could they take advantage of all the sales they can get from Switch 1, but also they can take advantage of the sales they would get for Switch 2. It wouldn't just be about maximizing on the large audience of Switch owners. It would also be about taking advantage of what we witnessed in the beginning of the Switch generation, which is being a significant release on a console for early adopters and entering the conversation as one of those games you want to pick up when you pick up the console even years afterwards, in other words establishing strong evergreen sales. So there may be many developers, both from Nintendo and third party, that may be clamoring for the opportunity to put out a major release in this first year of Switch 2. So while many may not be thinking that Legend ZA is the kind of game that would make sense as a cross-gen title, I'm not so sure. I think it's worthy of consideration here, and so we'll see on that one. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, there have been different happenings in both the news and rumor sphere that have made this conversation regarding cross-gen for Switch 2 even more interesting. So several examples coming from Midori, who's considered to be a very reliable leaker, who lately over the last few weeks has been talking about more and more codenames of different Nintendo projects. So one of those is Yu-King-Oh. And what we understand that to be is some sort of remaster for Breath of the Wild. Yu-King was the initial codename for the original Breath of the Wild, and so with the O, it's suggesting that that is some sort of remaster, most likely for Switch 2. And so this would be a different type of cross-gen situation, kind of like what we saw from Wii U to Switch, where there were a lot of games that had a separate release that were repurposed after the fact. Not cross-gen day and date like Breath of the Wild and Twilight Princess, but years afterwards, like, coincidentally, Breath of the Wild again, but for Switch 2. And it may not just be about putting Breath of the Wild in 4K 60 with other potential enhancements, but other big Nintendo Switch games on Switch 2. For some of the same reasons I argued for Legend ZA, getting these big games out there on Switch 2 to take advantage of the evergreen sales throughout the generation so they can stay relevant for an even longer amount of time. Games like Breath of the Wild or Super Smash Bros. Ultimate have continued to sell over the years, so perhaps Nintendo may want to get games like these out early on for Switch 2 so they can continue to have strong sales moving forward. I would like to also acknowledge the possibility that maybe some of these projects would be done just through a patch. Maybe if you already have the cartridge from Switch 1, you put it into your Switch 2, and for a small fee or even for free, you can see those enhancements. But moving beyond remasters, there are other codename projects from Midori that have been brought up in the conversation for Switch 2. There's SP Red, which many are simply taking to mean the next 3D Mario game. Now, I assume that this is going to be one of the biggest titles in the first year of Switch 2, perhaps the day one launch title, if not most likely the holiday title, one or the other. And this is going to be a big deal kind of game. It's going to be something that's going to showcase the hardware. Now perhaps they could take the time and make sure they have a cross-gen version that is so vastly better than the Switch 1 version that it still manages to showcase significant visual and performance improvements. But in general, I would say that the idea of cross-gen is not really representing vast differences between consoles, but rather levels of parity. Because I think you can argue that Sony has somewhat shot themselves in the foot with the great many of cross-gen games they have. They have given many PS4 owners reason to not move over so quickly. About half of their current user base is still on PlayStation 4. And PS5 has been out for years already, arguably about almost half of a generation. And even with this great many of cross-gen games Sony has put out, there still have been some exclusives that have truly showcased the hardware. Nintendo's going to need to do that. We don't know everything about Switch 2 yet. We know it's going to be more powerful, but there are likely going to be some other features on Switch 2 that will not be a thing on Switch 1. And so there are going to be games that will showcase not just visual improvements, but even some features as well. And when looking at the history of big 3D Mario games to start off new generations, they are typically games that showcase the differences from one generation to the next. So this idea that 3D Mario is going to be cross-gen, I think we should shy away from that thinking. I think that will be setting ourselves up for disappointment. This is going to be a game that most likely will be for just Nintendo Switch 2. However, another product that was mentioned by Midori was Silver Star. And many are thinking this is relating to something like Mario Odyssey because Mario Odyssey was called Red Star. So some have even argued that it could perhaps be a sequel to Super Mario Odyssey 2. Now this late into the game, I would assume that that's just not happening anymore. We should just be thinking about the next 3D Mario. But I had a theory that I focused more on in my prior video, so you can check that out, that maybe this Silver Star project isn't necessarily cancelled, but it's not a Mario game. It's actually tying to maybe something else, maybe Donkey Kong. And if that's the case, does that open the door for that to maybe be something coming out for Switch 1 still? It's certainly possible, but every major ambitious project that Nintendo's working on right now, I'm going to assume that if it hasn't been announced for Switch 1, is going to be a Switch 2 exclusive. So if there is a big brand new 3D Donkey Kong in the works, I'm assuming it's for Switch 2. Of course, Switch 2 isn't out yet, Nintendo's going to have a Direct in June, and the Donkey Kong Park is supposed to open soon, so maybe there still is a chance that there's going to be one last big Switch 1 exclusive that's coming seemingly out of left field here, and maybe it's Donkey Kong announcing the Direct to come out this holiday. I don't expect that, but we shall see. Now another codename project brought up by Midori is Banquet. Banquet seemingly is the next Mario Party, because Super Mario Party was also called Buffet, so it seems like there's a similar sort of theming going on there, and also this project supposedly is being made by ND Cube, the Mario Party developer. This is the kind of game that I assume is not coming out for Switch 2, I assume is not going to be necessarily a cross-gen title, but coming out for Switch 1 this year. It's the ideal game to put out at the end of a generation. A lot of people are going to buy it, it's going to be fun to play, and it's just going to be an overall good move for Nintendo at this point in the game. But maybe I shouldn't assume that Switch games that seem like are coming out in 2024 can't be cross-gen, because we recently actually learned some interesting details regarding the recently released remake of Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door. So there was a data mine that found some interesting details suggesting that there could be some level of 4K support in this game. Now, Nintendo Switch 1 can't do 4K support, but Switch 2 could. And while it's possible this bit of code left over may be relating to something else, maybe just about taking promotional pics or what have you, it's hard to say for sure, this conversation regarding Paper Mario having something to do with Switch 2 isn't the first time this has come up. The user interface in Thousand Year Door Remake is different from most other Switch games. They are using the same style as the Super Famicom colored buttons, and many have been thinking with this increase of colored buttons, not just with Paper Mario but other games, that maybe some developers are starting to future-proof their games for the incoming generation of Switch 2. The suggestion being that Switch 2 will have colored buttons. Now this is an unproven theory at this point, but I love the thinking behind this one, because the idea of future-proofing your games, maybe having 4K support down the road, putting in colored buttons, assuming the Switch 2 does have colored buttons, you're positioning games like Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door for when Switch 2 does come out, be it months or a year or so later. There can be an easy patch where there's a 4K version of Thousand Year Door, maybe with a few other visual or performance enhancements, and it already has the color button overlay, so it matches really well to Switch 2. I'll also point out that most games, the type of UI they use, the way they show their buttons on screen, match the console, because the idea behind it is to show the button on screen so players understand what to press on the controller. So going with colored buttons would make sense if they plan for this game to have evergreen sales moving forward on Nintendo Switch 2 if it has colored buttons. And so this would make the choice of going with colored buttons on Switch 1 a very, very unusual thing that we haven't really started to see until recently. So Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, along with other games, maybe this rumored Mario Party game that could be coming out later this year, are going to be somewhat future-proofed here, and are going to be positioned to still be meaningful games to pick up and play during the Switch 2 generation. Now, something else that I will mention here, that there's this rumor coming from Brazil. So Brazil is considered to be a reliable leaker by some, who has talked about a few different things, including the initially reported Switch 2 delay, which they were the first to break the story on, but then also an April Nintendo Direct, which did not happen. So I'm somewhat skeptical on what we're hearing on here, but of course, with plans changing and such, it may still very well be the case that they have good inside knowledge here. Based off what they're hearing from the combination of speculation and actual news from their sources, there is going to be a remaster of a 3DS game and a GameCube game coming out after this current fiscal year when Switch 2 is already out for Switch 1. So that would mean after March of 2025. Now, what's interesting about this is that if this is true, this could end up being something very similar to another remaster remake situation like Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, as we just discussed, may have been future-proofed. And there could be other games that could be future-proofed that come out down the road. And the overall suggestion here is that what we're going to be seeing as we go through this transition from Switch 1 to Switch 2 is that it's going to be handled very similarly to the transition from Nintendo 3DS to Switch 1. Something that I've been arguing for well over a year already at this point. When you look at the last couple years of Nintendo 3DS, it was during the Switch era. The last published Nintendo title on 3DS came out March of 2019. Switch came out March of 2017. There were still games coming out in those last 2 years. However, most of those games were remakes and remasters. Kind of like what the bulk of the games we are getting now, and what some of the rumors are indicating we're going to be getting even afterwards. And maybe these remakes and remasters will be purposed in a way where they can have updates so they can look and run a little bit better on Switch 2. But all the brand new titles that Nintendo devs are working on now are going to be Switch 2 exclusives to showcase the difference. In other words, I'm not thinking Nintendo is going to make the same mistake as Sony and have most of their games be cross-gen, just the remakes and remasters. The only exceptions being games we've already seen announced for Switch 1, like maybe Pokemon Legends EA and Metroid Prime 4. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart, thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.